Yeah, thanks so much, Josh, for that introduction and for inviting me to this symposium. Today I want to talk about taking a theoretically informed approach to inferring characteristics of broad social science interest from digital traces. Now, I hope everyone here knows what this term means when I say digital traces. In case anyone doesn't, what I'm talking about here is digital data that may be created manually or automatically that may indicate certain relevant details about people, places, things, ideas, organizations, etc. Not all traces are useful for research necessarily, but those that are can be deceiving at times, and we shouldn't automatically assume that they mean what they appear to mean in every instance. And so my presentation today is an attempt to establish a set of criteria by which the quality of inferences based on digital traces may be judged. And so basically, so for example, if you claim that if you're claiming in your research that a person is a woman or a Latino, or physically located in Ann Arbor, Michigan, on the basis of a trace, you want to make sure that that inference is on as solid ground as it possibly can be. And so the framework I'm going to talk about today helps us to distinguish between more and less justified trace inferences, which ideally will contribute to better trace-based research. First thing I want to say is that ideally some version of the contents of this presentation will make it into a book that I'm considering writing. We'll see how that turns out. The core questions of this book will be, when are trace-based inferences justified, and how can we use traces in the most valid and effective ways in our research? My talk today uses as examples 3 individual level characteristics: gender, race, and location. And these are of broad interest across a number of the social sciences. And I'll start just by talking briefly about location. I'll talk about all 3 of those in detail, but you know, a common issue with inferring location from social media data is illustrated on the slide. So in many social media spaces, I can write whatever I want into the location field. So it can be a true location, it can be an abbreviation or a slang term, or a location that doesn't actually exist, a fictional location. And so, but even if it is a real location, how do we know that that's actually where I am? As you can see here, my location, my persistent location is Washington, D.C., but if someone were to infer that I'm there right now, they would be, of course, incorrect. And so when are researchers rather justified in taking these traces at face value, and when are they not? I think this is a hugely important class of questions for data science and anyone who deals with trace data in their research, but I don't think this has been systematically and extensively addressed. But if it has, please let me know, and I won't waste my time writing a brand new book about it, so let me know about that. All right, so come up with these 4 factors to help researchers judge the validity of trace inferences that they're thinking about making. And these are these 4 factors that affect trace validity. They're nested, and the reason why they're nested is because each of the inner factors plays out entirely within the confines of everything that encapsulates it. So, for example, everything within a platform's terms of service, everything that a platform's terms of service forbids is nevertheless possible or made possible by the technical design of that platform. Otherwise, you wouldn't need the terms of service to forbid it. And social contexts can only establish themselves if they refrain from systematically violating terms of service, right? So all of these things are circumscribed by the items that enclose them. And so I'll discuss each of these factors in turn, but before I do, I'm sure that some of you may be looking at this and saying, oh, well, where's this factor that I think is really important? And I certainly would welcome those comments if you have them, if you see anything that's not represented here. But also please try to appreciate my task here, where I'm trying to come up with a parsimonious way of taking a look at the classes of factors that affect the validity of trace inferences. And so trying not to end up with, you know, dozens of these that I have to deal with, and trying to find very parsimonious ways of looking at small numbers of those. So if you do have those comments, I'll see if I can add maybe 1 or 2 or integrate existing concerns into this framework as I've developed it. All right, so let's talk about these in turn. Technical design, the role of technical design in circumscribing behavior, I think is fairly well understood, so I won't belabor this point too much. To be brief, a platform's technical design bounds the outer limits of what you can do in that platform. So as you can see, profile options, as displayed on this slide, let users indicate their sex, not gender, sex, hometown, political views, religious views, among other things. There are certain things that are not included here, ethnicity, height, weight, net worth, etc. And that has a massive effect on what you can infer from Facebook's data, what they provide fields for and what they don't, what people decide to talk about in their conversations with one another, and what they don't. Terms of service. So in addition to being extremely long and read by almost no one, also function as the platform-specific equivalent of a legal code. While technical design is essentially descriptive in nature in terms of what it circumscribes, the behaviors that it circumscribes, terms of service are prescriptive, like the laws that govern us. That means that I'm empowered to break any aspect of a platform's terms of service, but I may be subject to consequences if I do so. That, of course, in turn requires enforcement protocols that have some teeth, as it were. Otherwise, the terms of service are, of course, irrelevant. The best example here, probably the best known one, is Facebook's real name requirement, which of course has in turn cultivated a real name norm on the site, even though I think we can all think of examples of where people are not using their real names. And so that in turn makes inference techniques that rely on the assumption of a real name more valid within Facebook than they would be in something like Twitter, where there is no real name requirement. And so not all of these terms of service will be relevant to the process of trace inference, but we really do need to pay very specific attention to those that are. All right, social context. This is basically a catch-all for any difference between social groups which may affect the validity of trace-based inferences. The example I'll give here, actually I'll give two examples, one of which comes from Black Twitter. And if you know anything about Black Twitter, you know that many of its participants have colorful pseudonyms or very uncommon names, right? So off-the-shelf gender or ethnicity detection methods that rely on names, sort of a commonality of names or an index between very common names and ethnicity or gender might fail on many or even most Black Twitter participants, as you can see from the example on the slide. Even a custom solution might have trouble due to the sheer diversity of names and naming conventions. Right? Now, let's compare this to a very different example, very different Twitter population in this case, professional American journalists, right? And so this, despite the fact that Twitter's terms of service allows these pseudonyms among professional American journalists, there is a very strong norm of real name use. And so, another factor there is that they are overwhelmingly white with relatively traditional names, at least compared to Black Twitter. And so if you were going to take one of these off-the-shelf gender detection or perhaps ethnicity detection systems, you would be on much firmer grounds applying them to American mainstream journalists than you would to Black Twitter on the basis of the differences in social context between those two groups. All right, last one, potential for misrepresentation. This is a very important and particularly relevant subset of social context, right? Now, I'm sure this will come as a shock to you all, but sometimes people are not 100% honest online about who they are. It's just gonna blow your minds here, right? And so under normal circumstances, we tend to assume people are who they say they are as long as there's no reason to believe otherwise, right? And so the purpose of this factor of potential for misrepresentation, is to alert researchers to the fact that in certain contexts, systematic incentives or cultural conventions exist in which people's online representations don't match their offline identities, right? So a key concept here from cyberculture studies is identity tourism, where people explore other identities online for entertainment or educational purposes. And so here's one that is represented on the slide. This is a common on in certain forms of online gaming, massively multiplayer online role-playing games, MMORPGs, yes. Another is this phenomenon of catfishing. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. This is where certain users of online dating sites will pretend to be other people to deceive unsuspecting victims for laughs, or I guess. I don't know why they do it, but they do it enough to the point where it has its own name. And so the point is that when you're trying to investigate any particular research context, you have to have a strong understanding of the platforms and the populations that you're studying to know how much of a problem this will be for your particular research question or project. All right, so now I want to sort of go through these three different individual level characteristics and look at them through the lens of this sort of four-factor framework that I've developed. So we'll start off with gender, which actually turns out to be the least complicated of the three, I think at least, although it's certainly complicated enough in its own right. And so there are several methods of detecting gender from traces in literature. In terms of data sources, some of the most common are, for lack of a better term, gender fields. So this is where people directly indicate what their gender is. There's a drop-down box or some kind of radio button that says, here's my gender identity. And of course, one major factor there is the options that are offered. So, you know, traditionally you might have male or female. Now you might have male, female, genderqueer, or transgender, and a number of other gender-inclusive options that are gonna that may complicate your attempt to drop people into particular gender boxes. And that's best case, right? Then there's a person's given name, most of which are highly predictive of genders in most cultures, right? So, you know, think about John or Mary, highly predictive. Photos of users can be useful but difficult to automate. And in some cases, there have been some attempts to use what's called linguistic profiling to divine gender, but I actually don't put a whole lot of stock in that particular method, but I figured I would mention it because it is out there. Now, looking at this through the lens of the four dimensions, we see a number of key questions and issues that can help us to decide how to proceed. Now, the ones that I have up here are not necessarily exhaustive, but they do give a sense of the kinds of issues that come up when you're trying to look at this issue. So for technical design, we might ask the question of, yes, does a design offer gender fields? What gender options are available? Are there name fields or profile images that we can use point various computational inference methods at? Are real names required by the terms of service? And how strictly is this requirement enforced? For social context, do all groups reveal their genders equally or in the same ways? We may have to use multiple methods if we want to capture all of the groups of interest to us in our research context. In terms of misrepresentation, you know, catfishing I mentioned, identity tourism, fantasy fulfillment, any sort of incentives that may steer us a little bit off course in terms of people's offline gender representation. And let me dig a little bit deeper into this one in particular because I feel like there's a framework that we can use to think about this. So if we think about this in terms of conditional probability, right? This is sort of the nub of the problem that we're trying to get at. Probability, in this case, of an individual having an offline gender identity, self-identity, as female, given that their name is Mary. So in this case, we're looking at some sort of first name field or a full name field that would have this piece of data in it. And so now, we don't have to like numerically calculate this probability, although we could use social security data to do so. But under normal circumstances, I think we would probably assume that this probability is probably fairly high. Now, if you take a second look at some of the specific questions that are keyed to the different factors, you can see how, first of all, they're all set up as yes-no questions, but you can also see how a yes or a no answer to each question contributes to the validity of this inference. In other words, it raises the conditional probability of this of your inference actually being fairly valid. And so, you know, without a first name field, right? Like there could still be like a unitary name field, but if it's a first name field, you probably are on a little bit higher or a little bit better grounds making this inference. The impact of a real name policy should probably be obvious on this. Of course, it's going to raise conditional probability. The difficult parts about social context and misrepresentation is not assessing their impact on the conditional probability, it's finding the answers in the first place, right? So finding the answer to the question of whether people in Mary's social group typically use their first names and whether Mary has any known incentives to misrepresent her gender. And so qualitative research can actually be helpful here to sort of to give you some impression of this. The net effect of considering these questions in the context of trace inference is that the right answers increase your conditional probability, whereas the wrong answers wrong, or the answers that militate against it reduce your conditional probability. The more right answers that you have, the better an argument you can make for inferring the underlying reality from the trace that you're looking at. Let me see. So let's take a look at race and ethnicity. This is one that in some ways is similar to gender. So key data sources include family name. So rather than using the first name, their given name, you look at their last name, which in many cases is strongly predictive of at least broad categories of ethnicities in race. Although in the US, there can be some complications of that due to this country's history. Also, this method actually works a lot better for men than it does for women, because women change their name to get married many times. So that's another thing to consider. Physical location, you can actually tie together names with physical location due to the legacy of residential segregation in this country. If you combine those two factors, you can get, some studies have reported fairly good ability to predict race and ethnicity on the basis of those two pieces of trace data. Profile photos, you can have people look at those, and so there you're getting away from data science. It's rather difficult to come up with some form of computer vision that can extract this data, at least as far as I've seen. In language use, there's also been some linguistic profiling that's attempted to divine race and ethnicity on the basis of how people write or speak, but there are similar issues to that as there are with gender. In terms of the individual factors, the questions and issues, right, so these are things that are key to these data sources for technical design. Can users upload profiles? Is there geographical information available? The service, again, are real names required, and our profile images to be of the user, right? So if you look at a site like Twitter, you'll see profile images that are of landscapes or of their dogs or of their kids or whatever it is. And so that requirement would increase the likelihood that this would be a valid inference. In terms of social context, differ in their tendency to use pseudonyms, right? And so we know that this tendency is not evenly distributed. Do certain pseudonym conventions connote race and ethnicity? I can go into this more in Q&A if you're interested. Certain types of pseudonyms that may convey this and that may be computationally. In terms of misrepresentation, there are a number of factors here, including identity tourism, which are discussed. Choice voice, which is where someone occupying a marginalized identity will actually change their profile image or perhaps their name. Mockery is kind of almost the opposite, trying to adopt, say, a racist caricature of their target and try to harass them using that. So several issues here. And the last one is geographic location. The gold standard here is GPS, which is usually fairly good if there is an opt-in GPS option in whatever social system you happen to be studying. Zip codes also provide fairly good degrees of granularity if you can assume that people are putting in their correct zip codes. I think in most cases that's probably true. If there's a persistent location field, again, like the one that Twitter offers, people can enter anything they want into those, but there have been several computational attempts to try to extract reasonable levels of location data on that basis. One of the things that happens with the persistent location field is that the more coarse your location interests, the more likely you are to be able to get good data from that. So for example, you can get better data at the country level than you can at the state level, and better information at the state level than you can at the city level. Now, are location-bearing messages, but not everyone talks about where they are in their messages in social media systems and in other communication systems, and so that can be a bit sparse on depending on which populations you're talking about. Moving on to the factors, we can talk about this question of whether GPS opt-in is available. It's almost always available basis for obvious reasons. For zip code field, in terms of service, are there any location relevant requirements or prohibitions? Should be pretty easy to find out. For context, do people differ in their tendency? This could be a major issue to decrease their use of location revealing their location, reasons including protecting their privacy, in their tendency to ID abbreviation, right? So some people be a bit more straightforward in how they are. Some people may use slang terms or in terms of misrepresentation, there are a number of these. Travel is perhaps an inadvertent one. To take my own example, right? I say that my persistent location is in Washington, D.C., but I'm here now, so how do we deal with that? Protest solidarity, so it's from a well-documented anecdote from the Green Revolution in Iran in 2009, where a number of Twitter users changed their location to Tehran, ostensibly in an attempt to confuse the Iranian authorities who are trying to target a lot of people in Iran who are using Twitter. I don't think it works super well, not least of which because Twitter was not in a very high usage in Iran at the time. So it was something that people at least tried to do. And then troll avoidance is another one, either omitting a location or putting a false location to put people off if you, for example, have the fear that someone may accost you physically on the basis of where you say you are. So, all right, so I'm going to wrap up there. So one of the main takeaways from this is don't take traces at face value without good reason. Right? Seems obvious, and yet people do it all the time. The four-factor framework presented here can help researchers and reviewers of journal articles and books decide how best to use trace data, decide when these usages are justified and when they are less justified. Critically, the factors are platform independent. So I didn't want to key this to Facebook or to Twitter or anything. I wanted to make sure that whatever comes next, you'll be able to apply these factors just as well. And of course, the attractiveness of different kinds of data depends on these four dimensions and possibly others. And I'd be interested to hear if folks have other ideas about what can be included here in addition to what I've talked about today. And that, of course, is the final question of what is missing. And how can we keep this framework comprehensive yet manageable? And so I'll be interested to hear if anyone has any ideas about that during Q&A. But for now, thank you.
Humans and in general, just pulling out some examples, we saw people saying things like, the CDC actually admitted vaccines can cause autism while still touting the virtues of vaccinations. Please.